On 100.9 WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Evidence of Design. I'm your host, Jason Taylor, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning, everyone.
This is our 9th episode of Evidence of Design, and we come to you live on air from WXIR Studios in Rochester, New York, on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Normally, we are live, but this week, again, we are not live, folks, and we have pre-recorded this show due to prior commitments that Matt and I have. So normally, we'd love to invite you to call in, but not today. However, you can always email us throughout the week at evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. Also, don't forget that you can always listen to our past shows on YouTube by searching for the Evidence of Design channel. We are not ranked yet at the top of all the searches on YouTube, but if you go ahead and search something more specific like Evidence of Design Episode 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, our channel should come up. So on today's show, folks, we are going to be talking about what really Evidence of Design is all about. And Matt and I have kind of neglected to go into that as much as we could have. Now, Evidence of Design is all about the political economy, and that's the relationship between our political choices and economic outcomes. So on this show, we try to critique the political economic ideology of something called neoliberalism. Now, Matt and I have brought that up in some of our past episodes, and neoliberalism is really a belief in a free market, a small government, privatization, and financialization. And for folks who believe in those types of things, they generally believe that a society that has a free market, a small government, privatizes things, and financializes things, that is the best way to run society. Now, my own political beliefs, I strongly critique neoliberalism. I don't think it's the best way that we could be running our society. And in fact, I think it is very harmful to society. And I would argue that we generally lack a public discourse about the effects of neoliberalism. We generally lack a public discourse about the vastly unequal distributions of income and wealth that there are in society. And I argue that the type of inequality that we see today is by and large a product of neoliberal policies. So on this show, on Evidence of Design, we attempt to bring the inequalities that are produced by neoliberalism to the forefront. And Matt and I try to do that by talking about where the money is to be found in a lot of different social issues. We've talked about gun violence in America and how organizations like the NRA perhaps don't care about your freedoms as much as they care about your money. We've talked about Cambridge Analytica and the effects of political advertising in order to sort of target ads to people and make money off of targeting those ads. And now today we're going to really talk about some examples that have happened in the past that have really been examples of neoliberalism being implemented. And ultimately, if you're listening to the show, we hope that we are trying to create a vocabulary with you. We're trying to have a discussion and dialogue to really create the vocabulary that's necessary to critique and understand how it is our world works. Because neoliberalism it's like the worst word ever. It is so just academic and long and jargony. Yeah, it's so jargony. If you hopefully by the end of the day, if you kind of keep your eyes open, you'll recognize neoliberal policies when you see them. If we've done our job right, you'll be able to do that. And whether or not you want to invoke that term neoliberalism, hopefully you'll begin to see things and put the threads together so that we can have this vocabulary and actually come to critique the negative forces in our society that I think are ultimately pretty harmful. So if you folks want to read essentially everything I was talking about, sort of a short description of our show, it's online at a website that you should hopefully be checking out anyways, and that's 109, so 1009 WXIR.com, and you can read the description of our show online. Again, that's 1009 WXIR.com. All right, Matt, let's take it away. So after last week's imbroglio, I'm not going to attempt to say who the author was and the song title of that. Matt, help me out here.
Imbroglio?
Yes, the imbroglio of last week when I didn't know David Bowie and all what you said is a song that needs no introduction. Clearly, I needed an introduction. So I'm not even going to try this week. I'm not even going to try.
The song we chose this week is called Grown Men Don't Just Fall in the River Like That by the band Liars.
Who are the Liars?
They're a Australian and American band. Well, actually, it's just, I can't remember. It's only one guy now. I can't remember his name right now. But I believe he's Australian. And they're like a dance punk, post-punk, electronic, droney. They're changing all the time. They're a very interesting group.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Check them out.
That's great.
We're like 5 minutes in, Jason, and we already sound condescending.
Yeah, we kind of got a little nervous from last week's show that folks might think that we, Matt and I, hate each other. It's just our sense of humor.
Sure.
We kind of, yeah. Yeah. So you also kind of traumatized me, though, in all honesty. I will never be able to say like a song title ever on the show because I was real nervous about that. But let's get into it, Matt. Really the impetus for having this show, it's been too long since we had an actual show on neoliberalism, but there was a article released today, well, at least on the day that Matt and I were recording this, because again, unfortunately, we're not live for you. It was released on May 2nd on NPR, and the report is called How Puerto Rico's Debt Created a Perfect Storm Before the Storm. So for folks, you remember that Puerto Rico suffered from a Category 4 hurricane not too long ago.
Hurricane Maria in September.
Yeah, Hurricane Maria last September, and it quite, just devastated the islands. It was maybe one of 3 hurricanes that happened within a short time frame, I believe.
Yeah.
Irma and...
I can't remember the other one.
Yeah.
Houston was affected.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maria, it captured a lot of news because, of course, Puerto Rico is a sort of a territory of the U.S., and Puerto Rico had already been struggling for a long time economically.
A lot of people don't know what that means either. What, like, a territory is in relation to, like, the states or something.
We will do an episode on the 1890s and U.S. imperialism and how the U.S. acquired Puerto Rico and the Foraker Act and all the rest of it. We will definitely go there sometime, but... not today. But it is very interesting stuff, the Spanish-American War, folks. So Puerto Rico was struck by a bad hurricane last September, and as mentioned, Puerto Rico was really struggling for more than a decade from a lot of economic troubles that didn't receive all that much attention, although there's reports about it. I think you were kind of paying attention, but I mean...
it was not something that I was aware of until maybe last year.
Yeah, it would definitely be something that's easy to miss unless you're super into consuming news or you have family in Puerto Rico, as many Rochesterians. Somehow. Totally, yeah. And Rochester, of course, is a strong and proud Puerto Rican community in Rochester. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans who live here, and especially after Irma struck, a lot of more Puerto Ricans resettled in the U.S., whether for the first time or visiting their families. So in many ways, Hurricane Irma also affected all of us in Rochester, even if we don't have family in Puerto Rico, just because there's such a strong Puerto Rican community. And so, this NPR article that was released May 2nd, How Puerto Rico's Debt Created a Perfect Storm Before the Storm, it essentially argues that, as we mentioned, Puerto Rico had a lot of problems economically, and those problems were caused by amoral and not fair economic practices that caused the island to go into a lot of debt. And so the article kind of rolls that out, and unfortunately, so many things about economics these days are complicated and technical and jargony, and it's really hard to have a general discussion about them because you get into talking about debts and bonds and all the rest of it. It becomes very confusing, and we hope that our dialogue won't get too much into the weeds with that, and we'll just kind of help we'll invoke that term that we do every single episode, the average listener be able to talk about these things.
We would argue, and at least I think Jason would argue, and I tend to agree with him, that the reason why a lot of this is so difficult to understand is because the people who sort of benefit from these kinds of policies have made it difficult to understand, because technically what they're doing is is unethical. It is amoral, and it probably shouldn't be legal, but because of its complexity, they're able to get away with it, basically.
That's a really, really powerful point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Economics isn't something that just happens to people. We create economics. Like, as humans who participate in politics, as in we argue about how we should live in society together, we are the ones who create our economic system. And therefore, if economics is complicated, it's because we've all decided, whether or not we've given up on deciding entirely, which I think is what's happened recently, or those in power have decided for us, which is what's been happening. The system is going to work a certain way, and it's going to be complicated so people can't understand it. That's my opinion. And I think you see this all the time in a lot of other areas. For example, when you do your taxes, like doing taxes in America is really complicated, and there's all these loopholes. And if you're the average, again, the average tax filer, you probably don't understand how to take advantage of the system. And the reason why it's so complicated in part is because you have companies like TurboTax who purposely lobby against changes to the tax code that would make it simpler, because TurboTax wants people to use their tax system, and they market themselves as like making taxes so easy. And well, if doing your taxes was easy in the first place, you would never need a company like TurboTax. So TurboTax benefits off of the tax code being complicated.
Right.
And so TurboTax lobbies against simplifying the tax code.
Sure.
So I think that's a useful example, perhaps, of what we're trying to say. With that, most of these things, when you get into economics, I hope people don't shut down. I hope we actually engage. I hope we get over that barrier and actually take the challenge and engage, because that's the only way we're ever going to change the system, is if we can actually talk about them. And that's the whole point of the show, is to try to create the vocabulary necessary to change the system. So that's a strong point you bring up, Matt.
Do we want to give a brief rundown of Puerto Rico's history with this sort of economic disaster that they're facing?
Yeah, I would actually...
Is disaster too strong a word?
No, I mean, it's definitely a crisis. It's a systemic crisis, and I'll be honest, I don't know enough about the history of Puerto Rico that I would be comfortable kind of sharing with all of you folks out there, and especially for folks who might be listening who are from Puerto Rico. You definitely have more legitimacy and know how to explain the history. I would just encourage folks to read more about Puerto Rico and the crisis. And again, the article goes a little bit into that. May 2nd, NPR, How Puerto Rico's Debt Created a Perfect Storm Before the Storm. And I would just say that we'll get into the history when we actually delve into neoliberalism, but at least since the 1980s and 1990s, Puerto Rico started to have a lot of debt problems, because for a number of reasons they were running out of money, because the U.S. government gave Puerto Rico a lot of tax breaks, especially in the pharmaceutical industry.
They encouraged a lot of companies to move their production facilities over to Puerto Rico by giving it special tax exemption status in an effort to keep those businesses from going overseas, keeping the businesses local, basically.
Yeah. And
they were able to do that, I think, because Puerto Rico is a territory, not a state, for example.
Mm-hmm. So maybe exploiting loopholes in whatever business rules exist.
Yeah.
And we know that the U.S. is, by and large, the largest pharmaceutical industry giant in the world. New Zealand actually is the second, but the U.S. is far ahead of any other country in terms of pharmaceutical money and profit going on and production. And ultimately, we don't want to get too off field here, but the opioid crisis is perhaps a side effect of the power of the pharmaceutical industry giant that's been going on in the U.S. So, long story short, is those tax breaks to those pharmaceutical companies and other industries in Puerto Rico ended in either the mid-'80s or the mid-'90s, and therefore kind of really hurt the economy in Puerto Rico. And so the government had to start borrowing money to maintain the same standards of living that they had back when the production was going well. And that borrowing quickly became, well, once you borrow money that you can't pay back, you get into a tricky situation where if you have to borrow money to pay off the money that you've borrowed, things get real bad. And especially when banks are out there who are maybe taking advantage of you and trying to sell you loans or get you to engage in certain financial practices that aren't in your best financial interests, things can get real bad on a territory-wide scale like in Puerto Rico. And I think that's maybe all the background we'll give, because I'm sure there's whole books about Puerto Rico's situation. But
yeah, neither of us feel terribly qualified to talk about this at length. And it's kind of a shame that we're doing this another week where we can't have people call in, because this would be like a great opportunity to have people who do know more about it to chime in and share what they know. But hopefully we'll be able to go more in depth on this at a later point.
Yeah, and once again, folks, please do email us anytime, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We'd love to take your emails and read them on air and use them as direction for further shows. We'd love to have your participation. And so, Matt, I think it's useful now to really delve into what is neoliberalism and kind of what that's all about. But first, we should probably say that folks are listening to WXIR here in Rochester, New York on 100.9 FM.
You didn't need me to prompt you this time.
I got this down. I won't say any names of the songs that we'll play, but I got the station down.
I'm so proud of you.
And so, folks, neoliberalism, again, it's a political and economic philosophy. So a way you can kind of think about it is that just how we wear clothes and there's a certain fashion and style, maybe you could argue that there are certain economic styles and philosophies that people have, and neoliberalism could be argued that it's sort of what's in style now for how we run our politics and economics. I don't think that's the most helpful comparison, because style is usually fairly innocuous. Like however you dress can be fairly innocent, but ultimately there are people behind neoliberal political and economic policies that are doing what they're doing to make money for themselves. And so it's not so innocent. It's not by accident. So the way you can also think about it is that in the past, so neoliberalism really started as the premier political and economic philosophy in the 1970s. So the question is, what existed before then? And it's kind of tricky, but you could argue that something called Keynesian economics existed before then, and that name Keynes comes from a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes, and he was an economist from Britain who worked extensively with the U.S., but also other European powers, especially after World War II, to set up how the world's financial system works today. He did a lot of his work also at the Great Depression, when that rocked kind of the whole, at least Western world in the 1930s. And John Maynard Keynes' whole idea was that there's something called demand-side economics, and that in economic policy, we should be really worried about what consumers are able to do. So in Economics 101, you'd probably be taught that there's suppliers and demanders, who are known as consumers. And John Maynard Keynes was really, really concerned about the consumers, because in the U.S. and other Western industrialized countries, the economies are run by consumption. A common statistic in the U.S. is that around 70% of how the economy runs is done by private consumption. So like going to the store and buying something, that is what's running the American economy. So like 70% is just consumption. Now, if people aren't able to consume goods because they don't have enough spending money, or things become too expensive, then the whole economy gets into trouble. And so after the Great Depression, a lot of people came together and tried to decide, like, how can we prevent this from happening again? And so Keynes argued for what's called kind of priming the pump. And the idea behind that is the government should be able to inject money into the economy when consumption is down. So at any time when consumers are unable to buy goods and services, then the government should therefore buy goods and services, or put money in the system somehow to keep the whole thing going.
Now, what I'm hearing right now is that this sounds like a more hands-on approach for the government to play in terms of the economy, which is not what you would call in vogue these days.
Absolutely. Yeah, so a lot of people who think that the government should stay out of the economy would have problems, and did have problems with Keynesian economics, because they think that the government generally distorts the market, distorts the economy. arguably, they would argue that, you want a free market and things should just run themselves. Now, in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, our government, the U.S. government, did essentially Keynesian economics, and they bailed out the banks and other institutions in order to save the global financial system. There's lots of I think they're interesting, lots of really interesting arguments about whether or not that was the right move. But the fact is, today, we are living in arguably really similar economic conditions in the terms of the economic system. We're living in a very similar system than we were before 2008, before the recession. If the government didn't bail out the economy, if it didn't bail out the banks on the taxpayers' expense, I don't know what kind of world we'd be living in right now. I'm not saying it'd be anarchy and chaos. It might be a very different economic system because it would have all collapsed. And I get so frustrated. Like, I hate saying terms like the market and the economy because those things don't mean anything. Like, just saying them and throwing them around.
Very sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Abstract.
Yeah.
Terms.
It's so abstract. Like, we talk about all the time growing the economy. What is the economy?
Are you asking me?
Yeah. Well, it was rhetorical, but do you want to?
No, I don't.
Yeah, right. Like, think to yourself right now, like, what is the economy? And we talk about it all the time as if it's this thing that's out there and that you can pull a bunch of levers on it and it responds in certain ways. And ultimately, the economy is good. Like, we want a good economy. We want a healthy economy.
Healthy, strong, robust.
Right. I won't get into that because that's really interesting stuff, but it's sort of involved. And I just want people to question, at least come up with the vocabulary necessary to be like, what does that mean? Like, what does the economy mean? And I think we need to have more talks about that. But the whole point, let's go back to John Maynard Keynes. The whole point of talking about that is to say that there's other ways of thinking about how the economy and politics should run together. And John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics is a good example. That all kind of changed in the 1970s when you had the birth of neoliberalism. Now, if you break down the word neoliberalism, neo means new, and liberalism is a type of economic philosophy. Unfortunately, in America, liberal is a word that's used in many, many different contexts, whether politically, economically, or I want a liberal amount of jam on my bread, a lot of something. So liberal has a lot of different connotations. If you are a political liberal, you tend to be on the left side of the political spectrum, like you're a Democrat. If you are an economic liberal, this is where it gets real messy. It's not a black and white 50-50. In general, though, if you are an economic liberal nowadays, like a free market liberal, you tend to be on the right side of the political spectrum. A lot of people would argue with me about that, but I would stand by that and argue that if you are an economic liberal, you tend to be conservative in general, and a political liberal is on the left. So when you're talking about liberalism economically, that really comes about from 1776, a book by this guy named Adam Smith, and he wrote what's called The Wealth of Nations. And that book really set up what is modern economics. He's kind of the founder, Adam Smith, of modern economics, he's known as. And he came up with this idea called, well, he at least wrote popularly about the idea. I don't want to say he's the first person ever to come up with it because I don't know that.
Popularized the idea.
Yeah, it was definitely popularized, called the invisible hand. And have you heard of that, Matt?
I remember hearing about that in 9th grade or 10th grade social studies all the time.
Sure. Yeah, it's like a line in the textbook that's bolded, and I'm sure there's like in the margins a 2-sentence definition about the invisible hand.
Yeah, sure.
Totally. Well, the invisible hand in Adam Smith, he really wrote about the idea that, economies and societies generally run better when governments don't really get involved in them. And so we should just let people be their own entrepreneurs, and we should let people buy and sell goods freely. And therefore, society will somehow run itself the best way.
Would it be fair to say that Adam Smith felt that competition would sort of grow out of that naturally, and that it wouldn't need to be policed or regulated, rather, by a government force?
Yeah, I think competition at least is worth talking about, because that's a great way to phrase all this, that generally competition between human beings is a great thing, because as the consumer, as the buyer.
Well, to a degree.
Sure. Right. Yeah. In this opinion. Yeah. In this opinion, competition. If you're the buyer of a good, you are able to get the best product because obviously only the best product would somehow survive a competitive system.
A competition.
Yeah. Survive a competition. And also, the people who are making worse products would go do something else because they shouldn't be making bad products. So they'd go find another job to do or something like that. Or they'd get better.
Better their product, right?
Yeah, totally.
Better their service.
Yeah. So that's the idea behind competition. And, Adam Smith did write about the need for government intervention. He was not what you would call like a libertarian nowadays who says no government at all. Adam Smith was not a libertarian. He still argued for types of government intervention, and exactly I think what you're going for, Matt. He acknowledged times where free market competition isn't fair.
Would you be able to give an example of that?
Yeah, I mean picture the game Monopoly. If everyone when you play Monopoly starts off on an equal footing, but obviously in real life we don't all start on an equal footing. So some people have wealthy parents who died and left them companies and capital and money and savings and investments. Life isn't like Monopoly. So those people already start ahead of the game. And arguably that's why we have things like taxes on estates. So when super, super wealthy people pass away, the government makes money off of those families so that they can reinvest it in society. Because those families are just exorbitantly wealthy, and therefore they're just starting off with just way too much head start against everyone else. So that's an example of where the government should level the playing field in competition. Because those people, the problem with competition is that once you become the only one, once you become the best, the biggest kid on the playground,
you don't have to be the best anymore.
Yeah, you don't have to be the best because you're the only one.
Right.
So there's no more competition. So ironically, competition eats itself.
Yeah. Well, it destroys itself.
Destroys itself, yeah. And so the government has a role to always enable competitive conditions. So the government's job is actually is always to allow competition to happen. So what is there right now? Like a merger between T-Mobile and
Verizon? Or no, Sprint. It's
Sprint. It seems like it's one of those companies and another company planning to merge every 6 months. And
there was, what was it, AT&T and Time Warner became Spectrum like a year or two ago?
Yeah.
I think I read that there's only 4 major mobile phone service providers right now, and this merger would put it down to 3, with AT&T and Verizon being the top 2 most widely used providers, and then T-Mobile/Sprint being the 3rd most.
Yeah. Yeah. So
3 companies that provide mobile phone service in the entire country.
Totally. Like, we are living through a time right now that because of neoliberalism, because of this competitive system that isn't working the way it's supposed to, we are living in times where there are proto-monopolies. So there are essentially monopolies. This happens in who provides our cell service and internet service. This happens in who produces food. You go to the store and you see all these different brands of food. They're essentially owned by the same large corporations like Tyson, or I don't know if Kellogg's one of them, but
probably.
Yeah, I'd hate to just throw a name out there. I know Tyson's one of the large ones. And so in almost every industry, pharmaceuticals too, you end up seeing these large mega corporation brands that own a lot of like sub brands, and maybe it looks like there's competition. And of course there still is competition. There's not really full monopolies in a lot of sectors of society, but we're definitely living through a time where, because business is so powerful and because generally we haven't held our government accountable to holding businesses accountable, we're living through a time where there's a lot of sort of merging of power, consolidation of power on behalf of businesses. And there's so many directions we could take that. We could go to Citizens United, where the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people. People, yeah, they have the same First Amendment rights on political spending as people. We could look at the tax code that was just passed by the Republicans that cut taxes to the wealthy, that rescinded a lot of the effects of the estate tax, like I just talked about.
Cut the corporate tax from 35% to 21%, I believe.
20, yeah.
When I think I remember reading a report that said most large corporations, don't even pay 35% to begin with. It was something like 24%.
Yeah, so the nominal tax rate was 35%, so that's what it says on paper. It's the sticker price, but because of all the loopholes and incentives and deductibles and whatever else, how the tax code is structured, most corporations don't pay that anyways. So, sure, on paper we have 35%, but in practice there's a lot less. And so I get the argument that says, well, why don't we just reduce the sticker price then? Because why inflate the sticker price if no one's doing that anyways? Well, you either lower the sticker price or you get rid of the loopholes. So
right.
Either way, the problem is corporations aren't paying perhaps a whole lot of taxes. Although there'd be people who would punch me on that statement and say, absolutely not. Corporations are spending too much on taxes and they should have more money to spend on capital and all the rest of it. It is worth pointing out that it's so hard to frame this because there's so many things to talk about. I don't want to get too far afield, but Marco Rubio just came out this week and said that with a quote that I don't know if he's regretting now, but it was a great soundbite where he said that the tax break by the Republicans has really not benefited the people, and it's really only helped corporations give more money to its shareholders and stakeholders.
Really, he said that?
Yeah, he said that in an interview. It's worth looking up. I wish I had the actual quote and words. If we were doing this live, we could play the clip. But the whole point behind that is that when the tax cuts were passed, it was like, well, this would create more money to boost the economy and boost jobs, and of course, there were stories of companies who gave their workers wages. So I don't know, Walmart raised its wage from $10 an hour to $11 an hour or something like that. And I don't know if that was universal, but there's a lot of different stories like that. But also what they did a lot more of that was perhaps more unreported was they gave a lot more buybacks and money to their shareholders. So that is arguably, full disclosure, I'm not a huge fan of the tax cuts that were passed by the Republican-controlled House and Senate and signed by the president last year. But, arguably, I think that's part of neoliberal ideology that ends up benefiting corporations at the expense of people. So I don't know if we got too far afield because we're still trying to define what neoliberalism is, folks.
I just want to bring up real quick.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned earlier that neoliberalism kind of kicked off or really came in sort of became popular as an idea in the 1970s. And there's a lovely article that you and I actually talked a lot about last year. It came out it was published in October of 2016 by Matt Stoller. It was published on in the magazine The Atlantic, and it's called How Democrats Killed Their Populist Soul. And it sort of just details the history behind the new generation of Democrats that sort of took office after the Vietnam War had come to an end, and how Democrats shifted into a more sort of socially, focused policy making, while becoming much more similar to conservatives in their economic beliefs and policies. And I haven't read up on it recently, so I can't really go into too much detail about it, but I highly recommend checking that out if you want a really great primer or sort of introduction to this sort of thing. Yeah.
Ultimately, I would argue, and I think this article argues as well, that Democrats and Republicans pre-Trump, so if you put Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush on the stage and they're running against each other, I would argue both of their economic policies are pretty similar. Now,
I also want to mention that I don't want to sound critical of Democrats having a social focus. I think that's super important, but I think you can't fight a lot of the social issues that we suffer from today without also combating poverty and economic policy that sort of supports that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the social focus is one of the big consequences of neoliberalism, where we've no longer are viewing our social effects. We're only viewing our economic effects. What's the bottom line? What's the profit? What's the capital? As opposed to what are the effects on the lives of human beings? And I think we've lost a lot of that. So again, that article is How Democrats Lost Their Populist Soul
Killed Their Populist Soul, actually.
Killed Their Populist Soul.
Yeah.
By Matt Stoller on The Atlantic. It's a long article, but it's definitely worth looking into, I think. And so, folks, if you're still with us, you are listening to Evidence of Design here on 100.9 WXIR FM in Rochester, New York. This is our 9th episode of Evidence of Design, and we are talking today about neoliberalism, which is really what our show is all about. And I'm trying to set the stage and define neoliberalism for you. It is tough to do because there's so much involved, but a quick recap is there is different economic philosophies, there's different economic fashions and styles that we kind of go through to run our society. That we have gone through. Before the 1970s, it was largely Keynesian economics. We cared a lot about consumers. We cared a lot about how people had purchasing power to buy stuff. And the government helped the economy in times of struggle by putting in money.
We cared about keeping the playing field relatively level so that smaller companies could reasonably expect to compete with larger ones.
Yeah, and I think that's a safe generalization to say. In the 1970s, that started to change with the ideology of neoliberalism, and we kind of define neoliberalism as its new liberalism. So again, liberalism in America is you're on the left, you're a Democrat, you're a liberal, but economically it has roots in a book from this guy named Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And Adam Smith laid out kind of the economic principles of liberal economics, and that was free trade, laissez-faire government, that's French for like hands off, let do, so let the government or let the economy run itself, and the invisible hand, meaning there's this force out there that will automatically make our economy and society run the most efficiently possible by leaving the government out.
Is that sort of like the idea that the people itself will sort of guide, I guess, the movements of the market?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're all rational actors. It has a very specific focus on rationalism because, again, you're talking about the late 1700s, so you're still in the Enlightenment thought.
Yeah.
So very much rationalism, and individual human beings are rational and scientific thinkers, and we're going to do what makes the most sense economically. And we'll have competition to make great products and services, and life will be great. It's worth pointing out that when this started, Adam Smith called himself a moral philosopher. Economics back in the day was inseparable from politics and ethics and morals. Nowadays, they're all separate fields. We tend to think politics is its own thing, economics is its own thing, and ethics is its own thing. Of course, there's sort of crossbreeding between them all, and that's why our show is about the political economy. We're trying to recombine politics and economics, and of course, ethics underlies all of that. So back in the day, Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, and then around, it's tough. I would argue the late 1800s, you started to have a split. Politics and economics are separate, and I think that's how you start to get the conditions that people kind of lose touch of what their social effects of economics are. So in the 1970s, you had the birth of neoliberal policies, and they really came about from two different thinkers. One was an Austrian economist named Friedrich Hayek. Man, I hope I'm getting that right. Friedrich Hayek. So I usually just call him by his last name, Hayek. Hayek wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, I think in the early 50s, the 1950s, I believe. Friedrich Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom, and then in the United States, you had an economist by the name of Milton Friedman. So Friedman and Hayek, they're kind of known as Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. They were kind of the founders, the popular founders of neoliberal thought. They joined together at a society called the Mont Pelerin Society that might have been in Switzerland. Again, in these minor details, I might be getting mixed up. But they joined together at the Mont Pelerin Society, which is essentially a think tank. And it was a think tank where they tried to figure out what is a way that we can run society better, because they were kind of really skeptical of Keynesian economics, which was the economic theory of the time. So,
do you know why they were?
Ultimately, it goes back to, well, the title of Hayek's book is A Road to Serfdom. So it's very much, it was written in a time, remember, if I'm right in that it was the 50s, it was written in a time where the world had just witnessed the horrible effects of fascism in Italy and Germany. Yeah, and then, you're getting the rise of Stalinism, and arguably, I don't know, Matt. I used to know, and I should do more reading on that. I think that he was worried, and he was critiquing what he saw as like leftist politics, which was strong government control. So in fascism, and especially, of course, in Stalinism, there was strong government control in the economy. And I think Hayek and other people like him were worried about what they saw as like a liberal, strong government control encroachment. Again, folks, it's liberal politics and liberal economics are not the same thing. It's not the same spectrum, at least in the United States.
Right.
And so it's hard to make those comparisons. For me, as full disclosure, I am generally more politically left. I don't view Stalinism as a liberalism I identify with.
Right.
But folks on the right sometimes use that and say, well, look what happens when leftism gets its way is you get horrible government fascism and control and all that. To me, I don't view that as leftist at all. In fact, I view those policies as actually conservative. So it's a lot of finger pointing.
Well, authoritarian.
Yeah, authoritarian, right. So it's definitely, that gets super messy, but definitely worth talking about. And so I think Hayek was worried about what he saw as like strong government control in the economies. And so he wrote a book called A Road to Serfdom that really appealed to people. I mean, just that title, A Road to Serfdom, like look what happens. Look what's going to happen to us if these sort of leftist, centrally controlled economies get their way. We're all just going to be serfs again, like in feudalism, and just sort of till our land at the expense of governments.
So it's a popular book.
I don't know when it sold. It was, but I think it gained steam in academia.
It was academia, so it wasn't like the everyday, I guess, middle class individual was reading it or something like that.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No. You can find this stuff. Like you can find Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and I think even A Road to Serfdom maybe at Barnes & Noble. If you go to your local Barnes & Noble, it's there on the shelf. I mean, you can buy Adam Smith's A Wealth of Nations. These aren't dusty tomes that are like sitting in the bowels of libraries somewhere that I'm, bringing up right now. I mean, Barnes & Noble has A Wealth of Nations. You folks can read it. And if you've been in an economics class, like they teach that. So it's definitely out there. But yeah, Road to Serfdom is one of those monumental literatures in economic thought and theory, I think. So long story short is Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, they're at this think tank and they're critiquing what they saw as like centrally planned and controlled governments and economies, and they kind of started to create up the theories of what are now known as modern neoliberalism by invoking classical economics. So let's go back to the free market. Let's go back to laissez-faire, and let's do all of those things. And it's worth pointing out that the U.S. has always been essentially very much free market. The U.S. economy has never been similar to centrally planned Russia. The U.S. has always been pretty much
hands off.
Yeah. So we can engage in a lot of debate about how much government intervention there is in America. By and large, it's very much hands off. So, just to put things in perspective and context. In the 1970s, I'm going to skip the whole Chile thing. Long story short, Chile had an economic crisis, and the CIA kind of overthrew a dictator there, as they did a lot in the second half of the 1900s. They put up Augusto Pinochet, and they instituted neoliberal economics, and it turned the economy in Chile around. And a lot of folks were like, look at what happens. Like, we can use these policies, and we can turn economies around, and everything turns out all right.
But it didn't. Well,
I mean, at what cost? But I'm going to skip that whole thing. It's a much larger story, and we don't have time.
We should talk about that, though.
Yeah, it is a really interesting story. It's fascinating.
Anyway.
We're giving you folks a lot of homework, but yeah, definitely look up Chilean. There it is. Chilean economics in the 1970s. In the 1980s, here we are. You have Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. Those, of course, Ronald Reagan was the president of the U.S. and Margaret Thatcher was the prime minister of the U.K. By and large, people agree that the world became neoliberal in the 80s because Reagan and Thatcher, of course, were leaders of two of the most powerful countries on the planet, and they very much turned to neoliberalism. So Reagan historically slashed taxes. He cut spending on social welfare programs. He crushed unions like the Air Traffic Controllers Union. He had a lot of rhetoric about individualism and, pull up your bootstraps and free markets. So
he remains a commonly invoked name in a lot of conservative speeches and thought, I believe.
Yeah.
So his influence is still very much felt to this day, and I think his opinions are a lot of his beliefs are still widely sort of popular for a number of people.
Yeah. To me, I still think that we're living in Reagan's America. folks might disagree with that, but to me, we're definitely still living in Reagan's mission and vision of America. And arguably that was neoliberal thought. And so if you believe in neoliberalism, then generally you believe that the government should be small. It shouldn't have an active role in the economy. Taxes should be low because corporations should have a lot of money to do stuff with. You generally believe that social welfare programs should be small or non-existent because social welfare distorts the market and it makes people lazy and it makes them not want to work.
Right.
You have what's called austerity, and that's a word for saying the government doesn't spend a lot on stuff. So that also goes along with small government, also goes along with small social welfare programs. And you generally just have a belief in humanity. So this goes back to ontology from our last episode. Ontology being the study of, or like what you think the nature of humanity is, like the nature of being. You tend to have like an ontological point of view that says, people are best when they are just in competition with one another and they can just work their hardest and
push each other
to
be the best that they can be.
Yeah. And just, we kind of just bicker and fight, and then one of us is the best, and somehow that makes all of us better as society.
Yeah.
So
survival of the fittest in a way.
Yeah. Looking out for ourselves somehow makes all of us better.
Somehow takes care of everybody.
Yes. I, of course, don't share that perspective. I tend to be very much, we should look out as society. I'm a societally oriented person as opposed to an individually oriented person. I think
welfare programs are a necessity. They're important.
I definitely think they have a use. Yeah. I definitely think welfare and social, it doesn't need to be welfare. Social support is really useful.
We should take care of our sick, our elderly, the people who can no longer work.
Yeah.
People don't deserve to starve to death just because they, for whatever reason, lack the ability to work.
Absolutely. And so maybe I think the best way to take this is to go to that Matt Stoller article and say, where are we now, and how did Democrats and Republicans, what is the argument? How are Democrats and Republicans the same on this argument? In a political climate where everyone is so polarized, like, how can they agree on anything? How can I sit here and say that Democrats and Republicans generally have the same economic policies? I think it might be helpful to start with, take these for what you will. Reagan famously said that, we want a small government. Bill Clinton, who was sort of the darling of liberals for the past, the Clinton family was the new Kennedy family until 2016. But, Bill Clinton sort of famously said that big government is no longer the solution to our problems. We need a smaller government. So you have Bill Clinton even saying that, where big government is no longer going to help us out.
Right.
And ever since then, really, politicians on both sides of the aisle, although much more on conservatives, have argued for a limited government.
With the rise of the Tea Party, for example.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Tea Party was a huge reaction. And we see this all the time. It's like the only reason why, in my opinion, if you look at the votes, I think, really one of the main reasons why the Affordable Care Act is still here is because you had a more conservative arm of the Conservative Party that didn't want any government at all in anything that has to do with healthcare. Like you had Rand Paul and he's a senator from, Kentucky, I think.
Sounds right.
Yeah, I could be wrong on that.
Want me to fact check it?
Go ahead and fact check it.
I'm going to fact check it.
So you had Rand Paul and other Tea Party senators and members of the House who didn't have votes on changes to the Affordable Care Act because they didn't want any government intervention in healthcare at all.
You're right.
Kentucky?
Yep.
Great. Trust the gut. So, that really scares me because you look at, oh, great, we still have the Affordable Care Act, which I don't think is perfect, but I do think government should have a role in the healthcare, and I think that, the government can do a lot of good by being involved in the market. That's generally my belief. And I was really nervous and scared by seeing, great, the Affordable Care Act is still around. Obviously, it's still polarized, and people don't actually want to fix the underlying symptoms.
Obviously has a lot of problems.
Sure.
But I find it difficult to imagine anyone disagreeing with the idea that if somebody has an illness or a condition and we can cure it, that just because the person doesn't have the ability to personally pay for their treatment, we should just let them suffer or even perhaps die from that condition. I think I can't sympathize with that viewpoint at all, personally.
Yeah. I don't know if they would say that. I don't know if opponents of the Affordable Care Act would say, look, if you're sick and too poor to afford healthcare, then you should just kind of die. Maybe there are people who would say that. I'm optimistic that they have some sort of argument to say why the government shouldn't be involved, or that it raises rates of hardworking Americans, as they would say.
Right.
I don't know. I would just hope that they wouldn't say survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, leave everyone to themselves.
But you need some sort of system in place to take care of people who can't afford treatment. And if you eliminate that and don't offer an alternative, I don't know what kind of argument you're making other than screw you, got mine.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely really messy. There's so much to talk about here. There's really quite a lot. And I think arguably, again, going back to this argument that Democrats and Republicans have the same economic policies, the main argument is that no one is out there making the argument that we need to raise taxes because it's good for society, that we need a bigger government because government fundamentally helps people, that we need to I said raise taxes, but we also need to especially focus on the exorbitantly wealthy in America, and we need to somehow curb their power, either by restricting the amount of money they can donate to campaigns, either by taxing them more to have a wealth transfer, either by preventing corporate mergers and preventing corporations from having so much say in American politics. There's not many folks out there who are making that argument on a political platform. Democrats are generally making social arguments, like abortion should be a thing, legal immigration should be a thing, and illegal immigration, there should be systems in place to help those out.
We need to fight racism. We need to fight sexism in the workplace.
Yeah, intersectionality.
All of that stuff is important. All that stuff deserves to be talked about. But like I said earlier, Democrats today, typically, not all of them, but a lot of them align with conservatives when it comes to economic policy. And the problem is that the economic policy that's in place right now is what's causing a lot of inequality. It's directly responsible for that. And if you don't fight that, then you can't fight inequality, basically.
Mm-hmm. And here's my theory. Here's why this is all so important, is because the only reason you get Donald Trump is because the economic system has been broken for decades. The only reason you get Donald Trump is because there is exorbitant income and wealth inequality in America that no one is talking about. No one is putting that on the argument. So in 2016, I think you saw working Americans. And when I say working Americans, I actually mean class solidarity. Like, if you are someone listening to the radio right now and you have nothing else in your life to make money besides selling your labor, meaning you have to work to feed your family and yourself, then you are a member of the working class.
Most of us.
For most of us. Yeah, for most of again. So who's the middle class? What I'm saying is if you only have your labor to sell, if you happen to own a home, great, you can sell your home. Then you don't have a home anymore. Some folks don't even have a home to sell because they rent or whatever.
Sure.
So if you are someone who doesn't have stocks, bonds, and can sell capital and equity and investments and all the rest of it, if you have to work for a living, I'm talking about you. And that is most Americans. In 2016, I think most Americans, people who only have their labor to sell, their time, their existence, most Americans were like, this system's broken.
And they identified Donald Trump as potentially somebody who might change that.
Yeah, and that's also how you got Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump actually agreed on a number of key issues, which was really interesting. And then the difference, though, is that whereas Bernie Sanders was socially inclusive, Donald Trump was socially exclusive. Right. So when Bernie Sanders lost the nomination because the Democratic establishment essentially defeated him, then you get Donald Trump, who was tapping into people's fears
of the establishment.
So, yeah, absolutely. So, people were fearful, and they didn't know what to be fearful about because no one's talking about income and wealth inequality in a way that allows people to know what the problem is.
Which is why you're listening to this show.
That's right, Evidence of Design. So hopefully we can figure this out, because otherwise you listen to Donald Trump, who tells you that immigrants are the problem, which makes no sense. So this is the problem, is because
people people know that there's something wrong, that that they're being cheated somehow. But they're having these negative feelings, this unrest directed at a scapegoat, chiefly immigrants, through Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would argue, and I don't know, I don't have the statistic in front of me, but there's a million statistics out there that are really quite elegant and intellectually stable that say that the wealthy in the past 40 years, since neoliberalism started to be an economic policy, since the 1970s, 1980s, I've done other research on this, and you can listen to a 2-hour-long video on neoliberalism on our YouTube channel, Evidence of Design,
which nobody's gonna do.
But folks, 2 hours, you'll love it.
It's great stuff.
It's great. A lot more in depth. Long story short is, by and large, the wealthy, as in the 1%, have captured most gains, income, and wealth since the 1970s. At least a vast minority of gains since the 1970s. And it's really hard to point to because the 1% is able to hide that wealth. And because we all live in segregated societies, racially and economically, it's really hard to see people who actually have all that wealth because they live in fundamentally different worlds than all of us. And so we're not able to articulate what the problem is because it's hidden. Because as we started off the show mentioning the problems with Puerto Rico's economy, the rule and with taxation, the rules are so complex and convoluted that unless you actually study this for your job, you're not really going to have an easy time understanding it. And therefore, those in power who construct these systems are able to do it without ever anyone challenging them, because it's much easier to blame illegal immigrants, the scapegoat, than it is to blame the system.
Well, that's a much easier argument to understand.
Yeah.
Because, like we said earlier, the people who benefit from these economic policies have intentionally made it so complex that it's very difficult to articulate what exactly is wrong. And so just blaming another demographic, another group of people is infinitely more easy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Than grappling with the truth.
Yeah. And I can hear the counter argument that, Jason, instead of blaming immigrants or whatever, you're just blaming the 1%. And that may be true. I generally have fault with folks who have accumulated so much wealth that they will it's literally impossible for them to spend that wealth. If you've accumulated that much wealth and you're somehow putting it back into the economy to help people in whatever way, I'm not talking about philanthropy where you start your own foundation and you give out grants or whatever, that helps, sure, great. But ultimately, it's harmful to all of us if people have so much wealth that the best thing they can do is start foundations, because we could be using that money as consumers to be buying products to fuel the 70% of our economy that's run by domestic consumption. And I'm not just talking about, I don't want money to buy more stuff. I have strong bones to pick with, the way our economy works in terms of just consumption. But yeah, folks, I just look at the time and we are essentially out of time here on Evidence of Design. Thank you for listening. I hope this was at least a brief introduction on neoliberalism, and we will definitely get into this more. We'd love to hear your thoughts and concerns about today's episode. Please do email us, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. I was joined today by my co-host, Matt Treadwell.
Thanks for tuning in.
And my name is Jason Taylor. Thanks for listening to Evidence of Design, everyone. Be well, be safe. Bye-bye.